I woke up.
Yes, you did.
I missed you.
Oh, God.
I missed you so much.
Don't touch that ventilator! Daniel's voice tore through the ICU like a man being pulled apart with his bare hands. Across the glass, Elise's sister whispered, "It's been 5 years. Stop pretending love can wake the dead." The nurse froze. Daniel stood between Elise's hospital bed and the machines, shoulders shaking, eyes bloodshot, both hands spread like he could physically hold death back if it came one step closer. "Her fingers moved," he said. Nobody answered him. Not the doctor, not the nurse, not Eleanor, Elise's mother, who had cried herself empty years ago. Not Mara, the younger sister in a black coat, her face arranged into perfect grief. Then Daniel turned back toward Elise and saw it. A tear. One single tear rolled from the corner of her closed eye and down into her hair. For a second, nobody in that room breathed. Then her fingers twitched again. Daniel stumbled forward so hard his knee slammed into the bed rail. "Elise?" Her eyelids fluttered. The doctor rushed in. Commands flew across the room. Lights flashed into her eyes. Machines screamed in new rhythms. Eleanor dropped into a chair with a broken gasp. But all Elise heard, through the fog and the weight and the impossible distance of 5 stolen years, was a man sobbing like his soul had finally split open. "Baby," Daniel choked out. Please come back to me." Her eyes opened. The world was white, blurred, wet. And there he was, older, thinner, hollow in the face, tears dripping from his jaw, a wedding ring still on his hand. Her husband was crying like he had been holding those tears for half a decade and didn't know how to stop now that he finally had permission. Elise tried to speak. Nothing came out. Panic hit her all at once. She couldn't lift her arms, couldn't turn her head properly, couldn't understand why her body felt like a stranger's body. Daniel grabbed her hand carefully, like she might vanish if he held too tight. "It's okay," he whispered, even though he was trembling too hard for the words to sound steady. "You're safe. I'm here. I'm here." Safe. The word echoed strangely in her mind, because just before the darkness took her, she had not been safe. She remembered rain on the windshield, a bridge, her own breath going sharp and quick, and one terrible thought slamming through her chest. The brakes. Then the memory was gone. The doctor kept talking, but Elise wasn't listening anymore. Because over Daniel's shoulder, by the doorway, Mara was staring at her. And for the first time, Elise saw something underneath her sister's grief. Not relief. Fear. 3 days later, Elise learned 2 things that shattered her more than the accident ever had. The first was that she had been in a coma for 5 years, 2 months, and 11 days. The second was that she had a daughter. Daniel brought the little girl in, wearing yellow rain boots and a sweater with one sleeve half rolled, because she had dressed herself in a hurry. She stopped at the door. Big brown eyes, dark curls, Daniel's mouth, Elise's eyes. The child clutched a paper drawing to her chest and looked at the hospital bed, the way children look at storms through windows. Curious, afraid, and half convinced it might swallow them. Daniel knelt beside her. "Sophie, remember what Daddy told you?" Sophie nodded without taking her eyes off Elise. "That Mommy can hear us now?" Another nod. Elise's entire body shook with the effort to hold back tears. Daniel stood and carried the little girl closer. Sophie's fingers tightened on the drawing until it wrinkled. "Hi," Daniel said softly, voice cracking on the smallest word. This is your mommy. Sophie stared for so long, Elise thought her heart might stop. Then the little girl whispered, Are you going back to sleep again? Elise broke. The sound she made wasn't even a word. It was smaller, more painful. The sound of a mother discovering her child had learned how to fear losing her before ever knowing her. Daniel looked away and covered his mouth. Sophie flinched. Did I say something bad? No, Daniel said quickly, wiping his eyes. No, sweetheart. Mommy's just happy. That's all. Sophie looked uncertain. Then, with the serious courage only children have, she held out the drawing. It was 3 stick figures under a blue sky. 1 tall man, 1 tiny girl, and 1 woman lying in a rectangle with yellow flowers around it. Above them, in messy letters, it said, Waiting for Mommy. Elise cried so hard the monitor started screaming. That night, after Sophie had gone home with a neighbor Daniel trusted, Elise finally managed her first real words. They came out shredded. What happened? Daniel sat beside the bed in the dark, elbows on his knees. For a while he didn't answer. He just looked at their clasped hands, like he was trying to decide how much pain a woman who had just returned to the world could survive in one sitting. You crashed on Briar Bridge, he said at last. There was internal bleeding. You were 32 weeks pregnant. They did an emergency C-section. Sophie was 2 pounds, 9 ounces. Elise shut her eyes. A baby. Inside all that wreckage and rain, there had been a baby. She almost died, Daniel whispered. You both almost did. A long silence stretched between them. Then Elise forced out the question that had been clawing at her since she woke up. Why was Mara there? Daniel's jaw tightened. He leaned back, exhausted. Because everyone was there. Your mom, the board attorney, Mara. They wanted me to sign the end-of-life papers. Elise turned to him slowly. His face looked older than it should have. There were faint scars on one knuckle, deep lines near his mouth. A tiredness so complete it felt carved into his bones. I never signed, he said. Elise swallowed, throat burning. 5 years? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. 5 years. Why? Now it was Daniel's turn to look like he might break. He stood, walked to the window, then back again like he couldn't sit still with what he was about to say. Because every time they told me to let you go, something in me said no. Because I know you. Because I fixed old engines my whole life, and I learned something from broken things. Just because something goes quiet doesn't mean it's gone. And because... He stopped and looked at her. Because I promised you on our wedding day I wouldn't leave first. Aziz started crying again. But underneath that gratitude, another feeling kept twisting sharper every hour. A question. If Daniel had fought this hard for her, why did she remember driving away from him that night with a heart full of betrayal? The answer came back in ugly flashes. A gala. Champagne glasses. Mara stepping beside her in a silver dress and sliding a phone across the table. Photos. Daniel in a parking garage, his hand on another woman's back. Elise's stomach turned even in the hospital bed. You thought I was cheating, Daniel said quietly from the chair, reading her expression before she found the words. Her eyes snapped to his. He nodded once. You left the gala crying. I followed, but your sister stopped me in the lobby. Said you wanted space. Said if I chased you, I'd make it worse. Elise frowned. The memory stuttered. No, she whispered. I called you. You did. I missed it. By the time I got to the bridge, his voice failed for a second. By the time I got there, they were pulling your car out of the guardrail. His hands were shaking now. I listened to your voicemail 1,000 times, Elise. She stared at him. What voicemail? Daniel looked at her like the room had tilted. He reached into his wallet. Not for money. For something folded so many times it had gone soft at the edges. A transcript. He handed it to her. Her eyes moved slowly over the words. Daniel, I'm sorry. I think something's wrong with the car. The brakes aren't... The sentence ended there. Elise's chest went cold. Because that wasn't the whole memory. There had been another voice before the crash. A woman's voice. Close. Hissing through the rain. You always get everything. Elise's hand tightened on the paper. Daniel saw it. What is it? She tried to speak, but the memory burst apart again before it could form into language. Just rain, red taillights, a smell, expensive perfume and wet leather, her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then nothing. The next week turned into a war inside 4 white walls. Elise's body needed physical therapy, speech therapy, patience, and time. Mara needed her silent. She arrived every afternoon with flowers too expensive to smell real and sympathy so polished it made Elise sick. You gave us such a scare, Mara whispered one day, smoothing the blanket near Elise's legs. But don't worry, I've taken care of everything while you were resting. Westing. Elise wanted to throw the vase at her. Daniel was in the cafeteria arguing with billing when Mara leaned closer. You don't remember much, do you? Elise kept her face still. Mara smiled. It was a tiny smile, barely there, but it was the first honest expression Elise had seen from her since waking up. Maybe that's for the best, Mara murmured. Some nights are too ugly to survive twice. She stepped back just as Daniel returned. By the time he came through the door, Mara's sad little sister act was back in place. Daniel watched her leave, then turned to Elise. What happened? Elise tried to say it. Mara. He moved closer. Mara what? But the word dissolved in her broken speech, and frustration hit Elise so hard she smacked the bedside tray with her palm and burst into sobs. Daniel wrapped both arms around her carefully, as if holding together a wound he couldn't see. I know, he whispered into her hair. I know. I'm sorry. She shook her head against his shoulder. No, you don't know. Not yet. 2 nights later, Elise woke to voices outside her room. Mara. And a man she recognized from somewhere in the fog of her old life. Board counsel. If she's declared permanently impaired, the man said, control remains where it is. Mara lowered her voice, but not enough. And Daniel? He has no claim to Heart Consolidated, only Sophie's trust. Mara exhaled sharply. That child complicates everything. Elise's blood ran cold. The lawyer continued, "If your sister recovers enough to testify about the accident, old questions may return." Mara laughed under her breath. "Elise doesn't remember anything," she said. "And even if she does, grief makes people imagine things." Their footsteps faded. Elise stared at the dark ceiling, breath thin and fast. This was no longer just about the accident. Mara was afraid of what Elise might say, which meant there was something to say. The next morning, Elise asked Daniel for a notebook. Her hand shook so hard the pen slipped twice before she managed 3 jagged words. "She knows something." Daniel read it, then again. "You mean Mara?" Elise nodded. He sat very still. For a second, she could see the exact moment every sleepless night of the last 5 years rearranged itself in his mind. "Why do you think that?" Elise closed her eyes and pushed through the pain of memory. "Voice," she whispered. "Night, rain, perfume." Daniel stood so fast the chair legs scraped the floor. He paced once, then twice. He looked furious. Not wild, not reckless. Furious in the quiet, deadly way of a man who had been forced to swallow doubt for too long. "I told the police your brakes were cut," he said. Elise stared. He laughed bitterly. "You forgot, didn't you? I'm a mechanic. I rebuilt that car for you bolt by bolt. I knew what a broken line looked like. That wasn't wear and tear. It was a clean cut." A sickening chill spread through her. "Then why?" "Because I was your husband. Because I worked on the car. Because your father already thought I married you for money, and your sister cried in front of detectives and said we'd been fighting." He looked away. "They never charged me, but they didn't have to. Rumors did the job." Elise suddenly saw it. The hollow cheeks, the scarred hands, the old truck parked outside instead of his vintage shop van. "What happened to the garage?" she asked. Daniel gave her a tired smile that hurt more than anger would have. "I sold it in year 2. Insurance stopped covering most of your care. Sophie was in and out of the NICU for months. Something had to go." Elise pressed both hands over her mouth. Everything she'd lost in 5 years had happened to him while he was still awake enough to feel it. That afternoon, Sophie came back. This time she brought a stuffed rabbit with one ear sewn on crooked. She climbed onto the edge of the chair and studied Elise with solemn concentration. "You look different from the picture Daddy keeps in his wallet," she announced. Daniel, by the window, nearly choked. Elise smiled weakly. "Different? Bad?" Sophie considered it. "No, just tired." Daniel laughed through his nose, eyes suddenly wet again. Sophie leaned closer. "Daddy gets tired too. He cries in the laundry room when he thinks I'm asleep." Daniel froze. "Sweetheart." "It's okay," Sophie said, with the merciless honesty of 5-year-olds. Then she turned back to Elise. "I heard him ask you not to die. A lot." The room went silent. Elise looked at Daniel. He couldn't meet her eyes. Sophie lowered her voice. "I used to think maybe you didn't wake up because you were mad at us." That sentence landed like a knife. Elise reached for her daughter with a trembling hand. Sophie hesitated, then stepped forward. When Elise touched her cheek for the first time, both of them started crying, and Daniel had to leave the room. Because some happiness hurts almost as much as grief. That night, Elise asked him the question he had been avoiding. Who was the woman in the photo? Daniel leaned back in the chair, exhausted. Her name was Laura Kim, estate attorney. Elise blinked. He nodded. I met with her because your father had finally agreed to release your trust to you without all his conditions. I wanted to surprise you. Put the house in your name only. Make it clear, legally, that I never wanted a cent from your family. The shame hit Elise so hard she looked away. I was going to tell you after the gala, he said softly. Then Mara showed you those photos before I could. He paused. I never touched another woman, Elise. Not before the crash, not after. She looked back at him. The raw honesty in his face made it hard to breathe. 5 years is a long time, she whispered. So is one vow, he said. That was the moment Elise stopped thinking of waking up as survival and started thinking of it as a debt. Because if Daniel had spent 5 years fighting for her, she would spend whatever strength she had left fighting for the truth. The breakthrough came from something stupid. A song. A nurse humming in the hallway. 3 notes, light and careless. Mara's ringtone. Elise's whole body went rigid. Suddenly she was back in the rain, hands slipping on the steering wheel. Her phone lit up in the cup holder. Mara calling. She had answered on speaker. Where are you? Mara had asked. Going home. No, you're not, Mara had said, her voice sweet and venomous at once. You always run to him, even now. Elise had frowned, heart pounding. What are you talking about? Then Mara had said the words that ripped the memory wide open. You really should have checked your brakes before stealing my life. Elise screamed. The nurse came running. Daniel came faster. By the time he reached her, Elise was shaking so hard her teeth were chattering. She said it, Elise gasped. She said it. Daniel, she said it. And for the first time since she woke up, the full truth stood in the room with them. Mara had done it. But proving it would be another battle. And Mara was already making her next move.
2 days later, Eleanor arrived with tears in her eyes and divorce papers in her purse.
Not because Daniel wanted them, because Mara had convinced her mother that Elise needed peace and stability, and that Daniel's obsession was slowing her recovery. He's filled your head with suspicion, Eleanor pleaded beside the bed. Mara has carried this family for years. Daniel can barely pay his rent. Sweetheart, you need to think clearly. Elise stared at her mother in disbelief. Mom, she whispered, each word like glass. He saved me. Eleanor's face crumpled. I know he stayed, I know. But staying doesn't make a man good. Daniel heard that from the doorway. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just stood there, holding a backpack with Sophie's crayons sticking out of the top, looking like a man who had learned that humiliation was easier to survive than hope. That silence nearly killed Elise. Tell her, she demanded weakly. Daniel looked at her. Tell her what? The bills, the garage, the nights. He shook his head once. No. Why? Because pride was all he had left? Because he was tired? Because he loved her too much to weaponize his suffering against her family? His answer was quieter than all of it. Because I didn't do those things to be believed. Eleanor began to cry. Elise felt something in her harden. Not against Daniel. Against everyone who had mistaken his gentleness for weakness. A week later, Mara scheduled a board meeting and medical review in one room. Too efficient to be innocent. Their goal was simple. Establish Elise as mentally unstable, keep control of the company, and cut Daniel out of all meaningful decisions. Daniel wanted to postpone. Elise refused. "Take me," she said. She could walk 10 steps with a cane by then, 15 on a good morning. Enough to stand. Enough to be seen. The boardroom went dead silent when Daniel pushed the doors open. Mara, elegant in cream silk, dropped her pen. Eleanor stood up so fast her chair rolled backward. 3 board members stared like they'd seen a ghost climb out of its grave. Elise took 1 step, then another, then a third. Each one hurt. Good. She wanted it to hurt. She wanted the truth bought in blood if that's what it cost. Mara recovered first. Of course she did. "Elise," she said, tears appearing on command. "You should be resting." Elise kept moving until she reached the head of the table. Daniel stood 1 step behind her, close enough to catch her if she fell, far enough to let her fight her own war. The attorney cleared his throat. "Mrs. Reed, this is illegal." "My brakes," Elise said, voice rough but steady now. "Were cut." The room exploded. Board members leaned into each other. Eleanor covered her mouth. Mara let out a broken-sounding laugh. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Daniel, what have you been telling her?" Daniel's hands curled into fists. Elise lifted 1 trembling finger. "Don't." Mara looked at her sister and made 1 fatal mistake. She smiled. Not sadly, not kindly, triumphantly. Just for a second. But Elise saw it. So did Daniel. And so, suddenly, did Eleanor. "Mara," Eleanor breathed. Mara straightened. "This is absurd." "No," Daniel said quietly. "This is overdue." He stepped forward and placed a small evidence bag on the table. Inside was a silver charm bracelet, bent and blackened at one edge. Mara's face drained of color. Elise stared at it, then remembered. After the first loss of the brakes, she had swerved, reaching blindly for her phone, and something metallic had snagged on the gear shift. Something dangling, sparkling, familiar. Daniel's voice was ice. "Found in the frame when I bought back the wreck from the salvage yard last year." A board member frowned. "Why didn't you show this before?" Daniel looked at Mara. "Because I didn't know whose it was until my wife woke up." Mara stood abruptly. "This proves nothing." Elise's next words came out like judgment. "You called me." Mara froze. "In the car," Elise said. "You said, 'You always get everything.' You said I stole your life." Eleanor stared at her younger daughter as if she had never seen her before. Mara laughed too loudly. "She was in a coma for 5 years. You're trusting fragments?" And then the final nail arrived from a direction no one expected. Sophie. She had slipped away from the nanny in the hallway and wandered into the room clutching her rabbit. "Daddy?" Daniel turned in alarm. "Sophie!" But the little girl was already staring at Mara. "Mama doesn't like Aunt Mara's bell phone," she said. The room went still again. Eleanor frowned. "What?" Sophie shrugged. "It made Mommy cry in the hospital.
And Aunt Mara said if Mommy talked too much, we'd all lose our house.
Mara's head snapped toward the child.
That's not... You said it in the car,
Sophie replied, lip wobbling now.
when you thought I was sleeping.
Daniel went pale. Elise looked at Mara and suddenly understood everything. The desperation, the timing, the pressure to remove life support, the legal review, even using a child as accidental witness. Mara took one step back, then another, and that was all Eleanor needed. Her voice came out in a whisper sharp enough to cut skin. "What did you do?" Mara's eyes filled. For one impossible second, Elise saw not a villain, but a little girl who had spent her whole life resenting the light on someone else's face. Then the mask returned. "You want the truth?" Mara snapped. "Fine. I was tired of being second. Tired of Dad giving Elise the company, the house, the future, the perfect love story, while I cleaned up everyone's messes." Daniel looked at her like she hung the moon. Even half dead, she kept winning. Eleanor made a broken sound. Mara kept going, years of poison boiling over. "I only meant to scare her. Cut the line, let her spin out, let Daniel save her and become the hero for once. I didn't know about the baby. I didn't know the truck would hit her." Silence. Pure horror. Then Elise asked the question only a sister could ask. "And you lived with it?" Mara's chin trembled. "I lived with being invisible long before that." Security was called. Voices rose, chairs moved. Someone was already on the phone with police. But none of that mattered anymore. Because Daniel wasn't looking at Mara. He was looking at Elise. And Elise was looking at the man who had lost his name, his business, his sleep, his youth, and nearly his mind. And still showed up every day with flowers he couldn't afford, and hope that should have died years ago. After Mara was taken away, after the board adjourned in ruins, after Eleanor collapsed into apologies too late to change the past, Elise found Daniel alone in the hospital chapel. He was sitting in the last row, elbows on his knees, hands hanging between them. Not crying, just empty. Elise lowered herself onto the bench beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she whispered, "I'm sorry I believed the photo." He shut his eyes. "I'm sorry I missed the call." Her breath caught. "You didn't cut the brakes." "No," he said, voice breaking anyway. "But I still wasn't there." She turned toward him fully, every inch of her aching. "You were there for the 5 years after. Most people can't even stay for 5 hard minutes." That did it. Daniel folded forward, and the sob he let out was so raw, Elise thought it had been waiting in his chest since the bridge. She wrapped both arms around him, weakly, shaking. Not enough to hold all his grief, but enough to share the weight of it. "I came back," she whispered into his hair. He nodded against her shoulder, crying harder. "I know." "No," she said. "I came back to you." When he lifted his head, his face was wrecked. So was hers. And somehow, in the middle of all that ruin, he smiled. Months later, on a quiet afternoon under a bruised gold sky, Elise walked, really walked, across their tiny front yard without the cane. Daniel was on the porch, repairing Sophie's bike with grease on his hands. Sophie was chasing bubbles, shrieking every time one popped on her nose. It wasn't the life Elise had before. The mansion was gone. The board seat was gone. 5 years were gone forever. What remained was smaller, stronger too. A rented house with creaky steps, medical bills stacked in a drawer. A husband who still woke some nights, reaching across the bed to make sure she was breathing. A daughter who now ran into her arms without asking if she would disappear again. And love. Not the polished kind from wedding photos. The real kind. The kind that waits in hospitals. Sells everything. Gets humiliated. Keeps showing up. Breaks and still stays. That evening, Sophie crawled into Elise's lap and touched the scar near her collarbone. "Does it still hurt?" Elise looked at Daniel over their daughter's head. Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes it always would be. But she kissed Sophie's curls and said, "Not when I'm holding you." Daniel looked away quickly, pretending to check the porch light. Elise smiled, because she knew him now in a way only survival can teach you. He would probably cry in the laundry room again later. Only this time, maybe from relief. Some people wake up from a coma and discover the world moved on without them. Elise woke up and discovered love had been standing in the doorway the whole time, refusing to let go. Good night.